Death at Thornfield Manor, an Inspector Price investigation. Chapter 1. A Whisper from the Past. It was a grey morning in London when the letter arrived. Inspector Price of Scotland Yard had just finished a modest breakfast of poached eggs and tea in his lodgings, when his landlady, Mrs. Gallimore, bustled in with a stiff cream-coloured envelope on her silver tray. "Special courier, sir," she announced, her curiosity palpable, bearing the Cavendish seal, if I'm not mistaken. Price raised an eyebrow, wiping his hands carefully before taking the letter. The crimson wax bore the unmistakable crest of Thornfield Manor, the rampant lion and twin torches of House Cavendish. Memories stirred like dust in an attic. A year ago he had investigated the murder of a foreign attaché on those very grounds. That case had nearly ruptured diplomatic ties with Austria. He slit the seal with his penknife and unfolded the thick paper. It read, "My dear Inspector Price, forgive the suddenness of this request. I write to you with considerable urgency and utmost discretion. There has been an incident at Thornfield, one I cannot speak of openly through correspondence. It concerns my brother Edgar and the guests we are due to entertain this week. I implore you to come at once. Say only that you are an invited guest. The nature of your visit must remain between us. Yours in confidence, Lady Eleanor Cavendish." Price tapped the letter twice against his fingers, thinking he had not intended to leave London that week. Superintendent Archer was hardly fond of unannounced excursions. Yet something about Lady Eleanor's tone, the urgency, the secrecy, piqued him. She was not prone to melodrama. An hour later, he was aboard the northbound train to Northumberland, his suitcase neatly packed, the letter tucked in his coat pocket. Outside, the rain thickened into sleet as the landscape blurred into moors and hedgerows. He read a few pages from the Times, then settled into thought. What could possibly be troubling Thornfield again? Thornfield Manor came into view just past 5 that evening. Nestled amid forested hills, the sprawling Edwardian estate stood regal and sombre, its ivy-covered walls darkened by weather and age. Lanterns flickered in the windows. A line of motor cars and carriages dotted the gravel courtyard, and footmen moved briskly with umbrellas and trunks. Guests were already arriving. A liveried butler opened the front door as soon as Price stepped out of the hired cab. "Inspector Price," the man said in a low voice, "Lady Eleanor awaits you in the east drawing-room. I shall take your case." The manor's interior was much as he remembered: oak-panelled walls, heavy tapestries, and the unmistakable scent of polished brass and candle wax. The east drawing-room was warm with firelight and the faint crackle of a gramophone playing. Lady Eleanor Cavendish stood by the fireplace, still the picture of cool aristocratic poise in her high-collared navy gown. "Inspector," she said with genuine relief, "I'm grateful you came." "Your letter made it difficult not to," he replied. "What's happened?" She turned away, gathering her thoughts before speaking. "It's Edgar, my brother. Something is terribly wrong. He's become paranoid, evasive. He's taken to locking his study, hiding papers, and meeting guests in secret. Just this morning, I overheard him arguing with Miles, my cousin, something about betrayal and foreign hands, and yet he refuses to tell me anything." "Could he be involved in political matters again?" Price asked, recalling Lord Edgar's previous brush with diplomatic intrigue. "Possibly," she murmured. "He's been corresponding with foreign diplomats, some rather controversial ones. And tonight, we are hosting a private gala in honor of the Viscount of Essex and an ambassador from the Austro-Hungarian court." Price frowned. "That's a rather delicate pairing." "Quite, which is why I fear something is afoot. Edgar is convinced someone means him harm, and he's made enemies, influential ones. I had to ask for your help." "Of course," Price said gently. "I'll keep my presence discreet. If there's trouble to be found, I'll find it before it finds him." Just then the clock struck 6. A footman knocked and bowed. "Dinner is served in the marble hall, my lady." Lady Eleanor straightened. "Come, Inspector. If nothing else, you'll enjoy the company. The guest list is impressive this evening. The marble dining hall was as grand as any royal court. A long table of polished walnut stretched beneath a canopy of chandeliers, each place setting gleaming with silver and crystal. Lord Edgar Cavendish stood at the head of the table, his expression stern yet courteous. He was a tall, lean man, with iron-grey temples and a voice that carried command even in quiet. Beside him sat Viscount Edmund Holbrook, a man of Parliament known for his hawkish views, and across from him, Ambassador Clemens von Orlach, elegant and unreadable behind a monocle. As Price was introduced as an old friend of the family, he quietly took measure of the room. There was Lady Constance Weatherby, a noted society columnist, known for her sharp tongue, Colonel Marchbanks, recently retired from India, and Miles Cavendish, young, brash, and noticeably brooding. There were also two guests from the continent, Countess Livia Tanska and her companion, a wiry secretary named Emile Renard. The meal began with pheasant consommé, followed by roast beef with horseradish and red currant jelly. Conversation flowed in polite circles, though Price noted the undercurrents, sideways glances, guarded tones, veiled jabs about alliances and shifting loyalties. Then came the final toast. Lord Edgar rose, lifting his glass. "To peace," he said, "between friends and nations, between family and future. May the fires of betrayal be extinguished by the light of—" He stopped. His eyes widened, and the glass slipped from his hand. He staggered back, clutching at his chest, face turning ashen. Then, in full view of the assembled guests, Lord Edgar Cavendish collapsed to the floor. Lifeless. Gasps erupted. A scream followed. And just like that, Thornfield Manor was thrust once more into the cold embrace of death. Inspector Price stood slowly from his chair, his face unreadable. "It appears," he said grimly, "that my invitation was timely." Chapter 2. Whispers in the Hall. The guests scrambled to their feet, forming a semicircle around the crumpled form of Lord Edgar Cavendish. The shattered wineglass lay beside him, a crimson stain spreading across his starched white shirt. "Fetch doctor." "Compton at once," Lady Eleanor cried. Footmen dashed out, their footsteps echoing down the vaulted corridor. A tense silence gripped the room. Someone sobbed quietly. Inspector Price knelt by the body, pressing two fingers to Lord Edgar's neck. No pulse. He examined the glass, sniffed the remaining liquid, then discreetly wiped his fingers with a handkerchief. Ambassador von Orlach stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "A terrible tragedy," he said flatly. "Perhaps a seizure?" "No," Price replied, standing. "This wasn't natural. I believe Lord Edgar was poisoned." A hush fell. Viscount Holbrook sputtered. "Surely not. Here, at this table?" "Yes, and most likely during the meal, or the toast." Price turned to the footman. "Seal this room. No one leaves, no one enters until I say so." "But this is outrageous," cried Miles Cavendish, face flushed. "This is a dinner, not a crime scene." "It is now both," Price said sharply. Dr. Compton arrived 15 minutes later, an aging man in spectacles and tweeds. He confirmed the obvious. Death had come swiftly, likely within a minute or two. As he examined the body more closely, Price moved from guest to guest, his tone calm but firm. "Did Lord Edgar complain of illness before the toast?" he asked. "No," said Lady Weatherby, her voice quivering. "He was perfectly fine, until that moment." "Did anyone see him pour his own wine?" "He poured it himself," said Colonel Marchbanks. "He refused a refill from the footman." "And the bottle?" "It was quickly produced, an imported vintage, unopened until moments before dinner." Price studied the cork, careful not to disturb fingerprints. "Let me be very clear," he said, glancing around the room. "Lord Edgar did not die by accident. He was poisoned, and quite deliberately." "You're certain?" asked Countess Tanska. Her voice was soft, but her eyes were keen. "I've seen it before. Sudden collapse, no struggle, no injury. I believe someone tampered with either his glass or the wine itself." The guests shifted uncomfortably. "And if it was murder?" Miles asked, jaw tense. then someone in this room is a killer. By midnight, the guests had been dismissed to their quarters. Under heavy watch, Price issued orders for the estate to be locked down. No carriages were to leave. All staff were to remain on the grounds. Lady Eleanor sat in the library with Price, the fire casting long shadows across the rug. She looked older now, worn thin by grief and dread. Who would do this to him, she whispered. He had enemies, yes, but here in our home? That's what I intend to find out. Price leaned forward. Tell me, who did he quarrel with recently? She hesitated. Miles, my cousin. They've clashed for months over money, politics, legacy. Edgar was planning to change the will. He wanted to divert a portion of the Cavendish estate, some of the land holdings, to fund a school for orphans. Miles saw it as betrayal. That could be motive, she nodded. There's also the ambassador, von Orlach. Edgar didn't trust him. He suspected him of financing certain political factions abroad. He even hinted at blackmail. And what of the others? Viscount Halbrook? Edgar didn't think much of him. Too eager for war. Edgar wanted diplomacy, trade, quiet influence. Halbrook believes in sabers and speeches. Price made notes in a small leather-bound book. Tell me about Countess Tanska. Lady Eleanor tilted her head. She's a mystery. Arrived 2 days ago, with her secretary, Emile Renard. Said she was visiting from Vienna on cultural matters, but Edgar kept his distance. I asked why. He only said, not all music is heard through notes. Price's brow furrowed. Renard? What do we know about him? Little. He barely speaks unless spoken to, watches everything. And the staff? I trust them, most of them, but even trust has limits, Inspector. Price spent the next hour interrogating the kitchen and serving staff. The head footman, a sturdy man named Jory, swore the wine bottle was brought up sealed from the cellar just before dinner. No tampering, Price asked. Not unless someone resealed the cork like a magician? And who set Lord Edgar's place? And that'd be Harriet. She's been with us 5 years. Harriet, a freckled girl with nervous eyes, told Price she polished the silver and set the glasses at 4 o'clock. No one touched Lord Edgar's place setting afterward. But Price noticed something peculiar. A faint smudge on the wine glass. Not a fingerprint, more like a faint powder trace. He sent it off to be tested by the local chemist, along with the rest of the wine. At 2:10 a.m., Price stood once again in Lord Edgar's study. He was exactly as Eleanor had described. Locked drawers, locked cabinets, and a massive desk cluttered with papers, maps, and a sealed letter addressed to the Right Honourable Simon Elsmer, Cabinet Office, Whitehall. He broke the seal. Inside was a report, typed marked confidential, detailing illicit arms shipments passing through British ports to foreign powers. One of the names mentioned in the margin was Renard. There was more, a list of anonymous donations made to shadowy advocacy groups in Europe. One name stood out in the ledger, East Halbrook. Price drew a long breath and exhaled through his nose. Politics, espionage, money. He was no longer investigating a dinner party murder. This was something far deeper. At dawn, a low fog rolled in over the estate, and as the sun rose reluctantly over the hills of Northumberland, Inspector Harold Price stood by the window of Lord Edgar's study, the dead man's letter in hand, and whispered to himself, "This wasn't just murder, this was a message." Chapter 3. A Study in Shadows. The morning at Thornfield Manor dawned cold and leaden. Inspector Price, having taken only a few hours' rest, was back on his feet, coat collar turned up against the chill. A fresh cup of black tea in one hand, and Lord Edgar's sealed letter in the other. Inside the study, Price had established a base of operations. The room was austere but elegant, lined with walnut bookshelves, a Persian carpet, and a heavy oak desk that dominated the center. On it, stacks of ledgers, diplomatic letters, and one shattered pocket watch, its face frozen at 7:34. Price sat down and began to sort through the contents of the desk with surgical precision. He took special interest in 3 items: a burnt fragment of a letter discovered in the fireplace, only partially consumed by the flames. It bore the words, "Final payment must reach Marseille by the 3rd. If Lord Cavendish intervenes." The rest was ash, a sealed envelope marked Privé Comte Tanska, hidden beneath the desk drawer's false bottom. It contained a handwritten note in French, referencing a rendezvous at Mont d'Or and using the code ER Emile Renard, a ledger of Cavendish holdings, with certain pages marked by folded corners. Many of these entries highlighted uncharacteristic financial activity over the last 4 months. Large cash withdrawals from a personal fund and a purchase of shares in a mining company near the Austro-Italian border. Price's mind ticked like clockwork. Lord Edgar had discovered something, or someone, too dangerous to name directly. And someone had silenced him before he could speak aloud. At 8 a.m. sharp, Lady Eleanor arrived in the study, dressed in deep mourning black, her face composed but pale. "I thought you should know," she said quietly. "Ambassador von Orlach has requested a carriage to return to London immediately. He claims he is due for an audience at the Foreign Office." Price raised an eyebrow. "He is a diplomat, yes, but this is still an active investigation. I cannot allow him to leave." "I thought as much," she said. "He's in the West Salon, reading a paper and pretending nothing happened." "Then I'll have a word." Before he left, Lady Eleanor glanced at the documents on the desk. "I never saw any of these. My brother was a private man, but not secretive, at least not until recently." "Did he say anything about Marseille?" She blinked. "Marseille? No. Or Mont d'Or?" She hesitated. "That's a resort in the Jura Mountains. He visited once years ago." "Why?" Price did not answer. He simply tucked the documents into a leather folder and stepped out. The West Salon was awash with golden morning light. Ambassador Clemens von Orlach sat in a high-backed chair beside a fireplace, monocle glinting in the flame. He wore a crisp charcoal suit with a silk cravat, and his gloved hands rested on a copy of Le Figaro. "Inspector," he said, folding the paper neatly, "have you come to delay me further?" "I've come to speak plainly," said Price, "and I hope you'll do the same." Von Orlach inclined his head, amused. "How very British. You were one of the last people to speak privately with Lord Edgar before dinner. What did you discuss?" "Trade, of course. Britain's influence on the Adriatic. We spoke cordially." "Did he seem tense?" "He seemed like a man burdened by knowledge he could not share." Price leaned forward slightly. "Did you threaten him?" The ambassador smiled thinly. "Do you think me so clumsy? If I wanted him dead, I wouldn't have done it with Bordeaux in front of a dozen guests." "You are fluent in French," Price continued. "Does the name Mont d'Or mean anything to you?" There was the slightest twitch at the ambassador's temple. "It's a mountain, and also a cheese. I am fond of neither." "And the initials ER?" Von Orlach's eyes narrowed. "Are you accusing me, Inspector?" "I'm asking you what you know." "I know that your late Lord Cavendish was about to expose something that would embarrass a great many men in London, Paris, and Vienna. I know he was playing a dangerous game, and that perhaps even you do not know the full rules." With that, von Orlach stood. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I will wait in my quarters. I suspect I shall be here longer than intended." Price stepped outside the salon and found Emile Renard speaking with one of the groundskeepers. The secretary was dressed in a sharp grey suit, his hair slicked, a small notebook clutched to his chest. When he noticed Price approaching, he quickly excused himself. "Mr. Renard," Price called. The man stopped but did not smile. "Inspector, you were present during the dinner. Where were you seated?" "I was not seated. I stood with the staff at the side. I'm not a guest." "Did you see who poured Lord Edgar's wine?" Renard paused. "He poured it himself. Declined assistance. I found it curious." "Do you often observe your surroundings so carefully?" Renard's mouth twitched. "When you're a secretary to nobility, it pays to listen more than speak." "And what of this?" Price held up the burnt letter fragment. "You recognize the hand?" Renard's eyes flickered. "I do not, but the mention of Marseille There are shipments that pass through there, often not recorded. Shipments of what? Arms, art sometimes, or secrets. Would you be willing to testify to this? I'm not certain I will be alive long enough, Inspector. By midday, the chemist from the nearby village sent word. The powder found on Lord Edgar's glass was aconitine, a deadly plant-derived alkaloid known as monkshood, fast-acting, nearly undetectable, and almost certainly introduced in powder form to his glass during dinner. The glass had borne no other fingerprints, except Lord Edgar's, and a faint partial from someone left-handed. Price closed his eyes briefly. Von Orlach was right-handed, so was Miles, and Halbrook, but Emile Renard was not. That evening Price called a discreet meeting with Lady Eleanor and her cousin Miles in the drawing-room. "I need your cooperation," he said to them both. "Tonight we will host another dinner. Everyone will attend." Miles frowned. "A reenactment?" "Not exactly. I want the same seating, the same service, and a decanter of identical wine. And I want to watch." Lady Eleanor hesitated. "You're baiting the killer. I'm setting a stage, and this time the play ends with an arrest." That night, as the fog thickened outside and the guests gathered once more at the long walnut table beneath the chandeliers, Inspector Price stood silently in the shadows, his gaze sweeping over each face. The wine was poured, the food was served. Someone here had killed Lord Edgar Cavendish, and Inspector Price was about to make them reveal themselves. Chapter 4. The Echoes of a Toast. Dinner at Thornfield Manor had never felt more theatrical. The long walnut dining table had been reset to exact detail. Crystal gleamed, silver cutlery caught the flickering light of a dozen candelabras, and the same Bordeaux wine rested in a fresh decanter at the head of the table. Inspector Price stood silently in the corner of the room, barely touching his food, his gaze darting from face to face. Every movement, every glance, every twitch was filed away in his mind. Seated at the head of the table was the visibly uncomfortable Miles Cavendish, now acting as family host. Price noticed his hand trembled slightly as he lifted his wineglass. Lady Eleanor sat to his right, wearing a dark silk gown, and the calm, cold poise of someone determined not to let grief show. On her left was Viscount Holbrook, expression hard and unreadable, eyes shaded beneath heavy brows. Ambassador von Orlach, as dapper as ever, sat halfway down the table, engaged in low conversation with Countess Livia Tunska. Her pale fingers toyed with her wineglass, but never brought it to her lips. Emile Renard stood behind her, quiet, hands clasped behind his back, watchful as ever. Colonel Marchbanks grumbled to a young servant about undercooked pheasant, while Lady Weatherby silently observed the entire room with her hawk-like eyes, scribbling something into a little leather notebook hidden under her napkin. The entire performance, deliberate, polished, tense, was proceeding exactly as Price had anticipated. Until the toast. Miles stood, awkwardly clearing his throat. "My lords, ladies, and honoured guests, though this evening marks a sombre memory, we gather in tribute to my late cousin Edgar. May we find peace in his memory, and perhaps even answers." He lifted his glass, others followed reluctantly. But before a single sip could be taken, the lights flickered. And then a crash, a shriek rang out from the far end of the room as a figure stumbled forward. Emile Renard. His face twisted in pain, eyes wide with panic. His hand clutched his throat, and he collapsed against the back of Countess Tunska's chair, convulsing. Lady Eleanor screamed. "Get back!" Price barked, rushing forward. Renard hit the floor, twitching violently, his eyes bulging. A line of foam escaped his lips. Dr. Compton was summoned at once, but it was too late. Emile Renard was dead. Within half an hour the room had been cleared again. It was the same symptoms, the same rapid deterioration. No wounds, no struggle, aconitine. The killer had struck again, but this time with a different victim. Lady Eleanor stood trembling by the fireplace, clutching a silk handkerchief. "He didn't even drink anything," she whispered. "He wasn't at the table. How is it possible?" Price didn't answer immediately. He was crouched beside Renard's corpse, examining the man's fingertips, the inside of his mouth, and a torn patch on the lining of his coat. In his gloved hand, Price held a small fragment of parchment he'd retrieved from the dead man's inside pocket. Barely visible were a few scribbled French words in pencil. "If I fall, tell Orlok. Tanska betrayed us." Inspector Price retired once more to the study. He laid out the map of connections like a puzzle. Renard, previously quiet and cautious, had become afraid. He was connected to Countess Tanska, perhaps even her accomplice. The letter fragment confirmed he was aware of a betrayal, possibly intended to frame von Orlok. His death was either meant to silence him or to punish him for shifting loyalties. And most tellingly, the way he died. He hadn't drunk from a glass. So where had the poison come from? Price sifted through Renard's belongings. A silver pocket watch, a pair of gloves, a pencil, and a small leather-bound journal written entirely in French shorthand. But it was the gloves that held his attention. On the inside of the right glove's index finger, barely visible, was a dusting of powder, purple-tinged, aconitine. The poison hadn't been consumed, it had been applied to something Renard touched, and the glove suggested it had been transferred deliberately, perhaps to something he was meant to carry. Price turned the gloves over again, then moved to examine the back of the dining chair Renard had leaned on as he died. There it was, a faint smudge on the carved wooden handle of the chair. Someone had prepared it, poisoned it, timed it. That night, Price interviewed Countess Livia Tanska in her private suite. The room was ornate and elegant. She sat on a chaise, robe cinched tightly, expression composed. "Inspector, I have already explained. Emile was my secretary. Efficient, dull. He had no enemies." Price pulled out the fragment. She stiffened. "Tell me about this," he said coolly. "He named you in death." She snatched the paper and tore it in two. "That proves nothing. It's not even signed. But your reaction is everything." Countess Tanska narrowed her eyes. "You think you understand Europe, Inspector? You think that Edgar Cavendish didn't play dangerous games with all of us? He was about to sell secrets to the highest bidder, and someone here wasn't willing to let that happen. You included." "I don't kill with my own hands," she said icily. "That may be true," Price replied, standing, "but someone here does." Back in his study, Price stared once more at the pages of Lord Edgar's confidential letter. It read, "ER was not the threat, he was the link. Find the one who convinced me to delay. They stood to gain everything from my silence." As the clock struck midnight, Price summoned the household staff and gathered the remaining guests in the grand hall. He looked at each face, knowing that the next time he addressed them, he would name a murderer. And that murderer, he suspected, had just made one fatal mistake. Chapter 5. The Man Behind the Curtain. Inspector Harold Price stood at the far end, in front of the grand fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. The hearth crackled behind him, throwing firelight across his stern face. "Two deaths," he began calmly, his voice echoing across the hall. "Lord Edgar Cavendish, Emile Renard. One the master of this house. The other, a quiet man who said very little, but saw far more than he was meant to." All eyes were on him. The guests stood grouped by instinct, nobility with nobility, diplomats with diplomats, servants apart like shadows along the walls. "And yet," Price continued, "it is not the manner of death that connects them, but the method. Both were poisoned with aconitine, also called monkshood, rare, potent, and specific. In both cases, the poison was introduced with precision. Lord Edgar's was added directly to his wineglass. Emile's was laced onto the handle of the chair he was directed to lean upon. He let the words settle, watched their effects ripple across the room. "But what matters most," Price said slowly, "is why they were killed. Lord Edgar had uncovered something vast, something dangerous. His files, many now destroyed or encrypted, contained references to illicit arms shipments, political bribes, and coded correspondences involving individuals with a vested interest in the destabilization of Europe. A stir among the guests. Von Orlach's brows tightened. Viscount Halbrook folded his arms. Lord Edgar, Price said, was preparing to expose a clandestine funding network, one funneling money through the Cavendish estate via false charities and mining investments to groups in the Balkans and beyond. His report, marked for the Cabinet Office, names one financier involved, one who had both means and motive to silence him. Price drew a slip of paper from his pocket. This ledger, recovered from the Cavendish study, identifies irregular transactions and anonymous donations. One such transaction bears the initial E. Halbrook. Care to explain, Viscount? Halbrook stiffened, then sneered. Rubbish. That could be any Edward. A clerical trick. You're not denying it outright, Price said coolly. Halbrook stepped forward. Inspector, I've served this country for 20 years. If I were involved in some conspiracy, I wouldn't be fool enough to sign it. No, said Price, but you might be fool enough to think no one would look. He turned next to Countess Tanska. You're not merely a cultural diplomat. You were part of the scheme, or at least adjacent to it. Your secretary, Emile Renard, was the courier. He carried documents between Edgar and his foreign contacts. But he switched allegiances, didn't he? Her expression was carved from marble. You have no proof? I have his death, Price said, and his note. Tanska betrayed us. That fragment alone places you at the center of the storm. Von Orlach finally spoke. And yet, Inspector, you still don't know who killed Lord Edgar. All this speculation. Who among us would go so far? Price nodded slowly. Indeed, who would have access to the wineglass? Who would know the layout of the table, the serving sequence, the habits of Lord Edgar? He turned finally to Miles Cavendish. The young man froze. Miles, Price said softly, you fought with your cousin just days before his death. You stood to lose a fortune under his new will. You've been gambling, haven't you? That's absurd, Miles began. I found proof of your debt in the study's waste bin. Several owed to gentlemen in London with rather colourful reputations. You were in debt, deeply, and you knew Edgar was about to sign everything away to charity. He was tearing the estate apart. Price's voice turned sharper. So you decided to stop him. You knew he preferred to pour his own wine. You slipped a dusting of poison into his glass while setting the table that afternoon. Perhaps even bribed one of the footmen to distract the others. While you did it, Lady Eleanor gasped, Miles, tell me it's not true. Miles's eyes flicked to her, then to Halbrook, then to Price. You don't understand, he said. Edgar was ruining us, giving away lands, inviting foreigners to pry into British affairs. He wasn't protecting the family. He was endangering it. And Renard, Price asked. Why kill him? He knew, Miles said quietly. He came to me that morning. He said he wanted protection, money, for his silence. He thought I'd be desperate enough to pay. Price took a step forward. And so you killed him. You lured him to the dining room early. You arranged for him to lean on the poisoned chair, back during the toast. An elegant irony. You used Edgar's own murder to cover the second. Miles's fists clenched. I did what I had to do. And what you did, said Price firmly, was murder. The manor exploded into gasps and accusations. Lady Eleanor collapsed into a chair, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Von Orlach simply nodded, as if confirming a long-held suspicion. Countess Tanska offered nothing but a thin-lipped smile. Price turned to the uniformed constables who had arrived earlier at his summons. Take Miles Cavendish into custody. Charge him with the murders of Lord Edgar Cavendish and Emile Renard. Further charges may follow. Miles made no attempt to resist. He allowed himself to be escorted from the room. Head bowed, a once proud aristocrat, now reduced to a prisoner. Later that evening, as the rain fell in thin sheets against the study window panes, Inspector Price sat in silence, sipping tea beside the fire. Lady Eleanor entered quietly. Her grief failed behind strength. "I suppose I owe you thanks," she said, voice steady. "No thanks required," Price replied. "But you do have my sympathy. Your family has been tested." She smiled faintly. "It always is, but Thornfield will endure." Price nodded. And as he stood to leave the manor once more, he glanced over his shoulder one final time. Chapter 6: The Final Reckoning. A cold breeze swept through London as Inspector Price stepped off the northbound train at King's Cross. By the time he reached Scotland Yard, the case files had already been collated. Statements from guests, staff, and witnesses filled 3 thick folders. At the top sat the confession of Miles Cavendish, signed in a trembling hand, witnessed by 2 constables and Price himself. "I poisoned Lord Edgar. I dusted the rim of his wineglass with aconitine that I had acquired weeks before. I wanted to stop him, before he ruined everything. I didn't mean to kill Renard at first, but once he knew, I saw no other way." A clear, truthful admission. Inspector Price sat with Superintendent Archer that afternoon in a dim-lit office of Division E, where the heavy ticking of a wall clock measured the slow rhythm of justice. "It's an open and shut case," Archer said, reviewing the signed statement. Price nodded, folding his hands. "The evidence is strong. There will be no doubt." "What of the guests?" Archer asked. "Anything further from the ambassador or the countess?" "Their roles were peripheral at best. They've been questioned and released. They'll return to their posts and likely wish to forget all of this." "Fair enough," said Archer. "But at least the man responsible for the killings will be punished." Price didn't reply immediately. He simply looked out the tall, rain-smeared window, watching carriages and passers-by go about their lives beneath the grey London sky. "Justice doesn't mend broken families," he said softly, "but it does close doors, and this door, at least, won't be left ajar." 2 weeks later, back at Thornfield Manor, Inspector Price paid a quiet visit at Lady Eleanor's request. They met in the library. The manor was quieter now, the rooms cleared of guests, the staff reduced to only those who had stayed through the storm. "I wanted to thank you, Inspector," Lady Eleanor said, her voice measured, "for everything. For the truth, for your patience." Price offered a polite nod. "And how is the house?" "Recovering," she said simply, "like a wound stitched but still tender. The past few days I've been going through Edgar's papers. I'm planning to restore part of the estate to the village. Build something useful. A school, perhaps." "A fitting legacy," Price replied. There was a pause and then she added, "Miles has written from prison. He's remorseful. I don't know if it's regret for the act or for being caught. Either way, he'll face what he's done." Price looked around the library one last time, the same room where the letter had first called him to Thornfield. "Thank you for your trust, Lady Eleanor. And thank you for your steadfastness, Inspector." On the train back to London, Price sat alone with his thoughts. No headlines greeted the conclusion of the Thornfield murders. No grand speeches, only silence, resolution, and the slow rhythm of railway wheels.